A spark in the quiet town. Eastonville was the kind of town where nothing ever felt too out of place. The kind of place where the streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, dogwood trees that bloomed every spring, and Victorian houses that seemed frozen in time. People knew each other by name, and the only real surprises that came to Eastonville were the tourists that visited the weekend farmers markets or the occasional parade. It had the air of a town that had proudly held on to its traditions, as if nothing could disrupt its peaceful, almost picturesque way of life. But beneath the surface of this small South Carolina town, a quieter, darker current ran, one that wasn't immediately visible. It was an undercurrent of small-town prejudices and preconceived notions, ones that rarely made their way to the surface, but lingered in the everyday interactions and comments that some tried not to see. That morning, the usual bustle of Eastonville's favorite breakfast spot, Mary's Sunrise Cafe, was in full swing. The clinking of coffee mugs, the low hum of chatter, and the smell of sizzling bacon filled the air. The place was busy as usual, packed with locals who knew each other by name and the occasional tourist passing through, grabbing a bite to eat before heading out to the next stop on their list of attractions. There, at the counter, sat Sylvia Henderson, a longtime resident of Eastonville, in her early 50s. Sylvia had lived in this small town her entire life, and over the years had become a fixture in the community. She was known for her biting remarks and sharp tongue, but to some, she was also endearing in her own way. However, it was no secret that Sylvia held certain views about the town she loved so much, the town she considered perfect in its own right. Sylvia wasn't openly hostile, but there was an unspoken judgment behind her actions, a silent resistance to change. She had seen the slow shifts happening around her, different people moving in, younger generations questioning traditions, and yes, even the occasional outsider passing through. But there was something about today that made Sylvia uncomfortable in a way that she couldn't quite place. As she sipped her coffee, Sylvia scanned the room. The usual crowd of construction workers were gathered in the corner, sipping their coffee before heading out for the day, and tourists flipped through brochures at the next table. But then her gaze fell on a young black woman sitting by herself at a corner booth, an unfamiliar face in this small, tight-knit town. The woman, sharply dressed in a black button-down shirt and dark jeans, sat with her phone in hand, glancing at it occasionally, but never looking up. Sylvia's sharp eyes narrowed as she took in the woman's quiet, alert demeanor. There was something off about her, something that Sylvia couldn't quite put her finger on. For a moment, Sylvia thought little of it, but as she continued to study the woman, an odd feeling began to form in her chest. Something about this stranger seemed out of place, almost foreign. In Sylvia's mind, people who didn't fit the mold of Eastonville, people who didn't belong, made her uneasy. She had grown up in this town, and to her, it represented a particular order, one where things had always been the same, one where everyone knew their place. She leaned forward, tapping her long acrylic nails on the side of her coffee mug, a gesture that betrayed her discomfort. "Who's that?" Sylvia whispered to the waitress, trying to be subtle. The waitress, a young woman with an unbothered demeanor, glanced over her shoulder. "I don't know. She's not from around here. Just came in and ordered an omelette to go." Sylvia's suspicion flared instantly. She wasn't sure why, but something about this woman felt like a disruption to the quiet routine she had come to cherish. It wasn't just that she was black. It was that she was different, an outsider. And in Sylvia's mind, outsiders didn't belong in Eastonville. "What's she doing here?" Sylvia muttered to herself, her gaze never leaving the woman. The stranger sat, calm and composed, completely unaware of the silent scrutiny she was under. Sylvia's discomfort grew. She began to scrutinize the woman's every move, looking for something suspicious, something out of place. After all, Sylvia had lived in Eastonville her whole life. She knew the kind of people who belonged. Outsiders were different, and they often brought trouble. The woman, Morgan Walker, sat unaware of the unwanted attention she had just garnered. Morgan was a rising star in the U.S. Secret Service. That day, she was undercover on a critical assignment, investigating a counterfeit currency operation that had been making its way along the I-95 corridor. She had been quietly observing the town as part of a larger investigation into a suspected counterfeit ring that was using Eastonville as one of its drop-off locations. Morgan had been trained to stay under the radar, to observe without drawing attention, and to gather intelligence without revealing her true identity. To her, the diner was just a pit stop, a place to grab a quick meal before continuing her investigation at a nearby farmhouse that was rumored to be linked to the counterfeit operation. What Sylvia saw, however, was a woman who didn't belong. Sylvia's mind was already racing, filling in blanks with her own assumptions, none of which were based on facts. She didn't know it, but Morgan's every move, every glance at her phone, only deepened the rift in Sylvia's perception. Where Sylvia saw suspicious behavior, Morgan was simply following protocol, checking her phone for updates and confirming directions to her next destination. Morgan's calmness only fueled Sylvia's fear. Sylvia watched as Morgan finished her meal and got up to leave, her bag slung over her shoulder. She seemed unhurried, almost too collected for someone just passing through a small town. Sylvia muttered under her breath, "I bet she's up to no good." A suspicion, rooted in something deeper than just what she saw, was born. And just as Morgan headed for the door, Sylvia's gut told her that something needed to be done. Without thinking twice, Sylvia made her decision. She quickly scribbled down the license plate number of Morgan's car, a dark sedan, and without hesitation, she made a call. Officer Chad Reynolds, Eastonville's most eager and ambitious cop, was always on the other end of her tips. The stage was set. Sylvia's assumptions, guided by a lifetime of biases, were about to push her into an encounter that neither she nor Morgan had planned for, nor could they have predicted. And at the heart of it all, Sylvia didn't realize that the very woman she considered a threat was a highly trained U.S. Secret Service agent, someone capable of handling far more than a small-town confrontation. But of course, Sylvia didn't know that. She didn't know that the woman she was about to target had been trained to deal with far greater threats than anything Eastonville could throw at her. The quiet town of Eastonville was about to be rocked by a revelation that no one could have seen coming. The confrontation. The town of Eastonville, usually quiet and reserved, felt charged with a strange energy that morning. Outside, the sun beat down, casting long shadows from the towering dogwood trees that lined the streets, while inside the local diner, a storm was beginning to brew, one that no one could anticipate. Sylvia Henderson stood outside, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching as Morgan Walker's dark sedan disappeared around the corner. It wasn't until Sylvia's car door slammed shut, her fingers curling tightly around the steering wheel, that she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There was something about this outsider, something that set off an instinct deep within her. She had seen enough to know that when something didn't sit right, it was her job to act, to protect her town. As Sylvia drove through the familiar streets of Eastonville, her mind raced with thoughts of what she had just witnessed. Was Morgan planning something? Was she truly the threat that Sylvia had convinced herself she was? The unease grew as Sylvia's thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios. She had grown up in Eastonville, and over the years, her eyes had trained themselves to notice when things didn't fit the pattern, when someone didn't belong. This woman, this quiet, confident stranger, had certainly raised her suspicions. Sylvia told herself that her actions were justified, even necessary. This was the kind of small-town vigilance that had kept Eastonville safe for generations. When Sylvia dialed Officer Chad Reynolds, the familiar voice on the other end did little to calm her racing thoughts. "What's going on, Sylvia?" he asked in his usual dry tone. "I'm telling you, Chad, there's something off about that woman," Sylvia insisted, her grip tightening on the phone. She came in, sat by herself, didn't interact with anyone, and left too quietly. And that car didn't even look like something that belongs here. Officer Reynolds, eager to prove himself, was always quick to jump at any chance to step into action, especially if it meant making a name for himself. "You want me to check it out?" he asked, clearly already on his way to suit up. "Yes," Sylvia urged, a hint of excitement creeping into her voice. "She's headed west, toward the old farmhouse on the outskirts. You should go look into it." Reynolds hesitated for just a moment, unsure if he was overstepping his bounds, but Sylvia's insistence won him over. "All right, I'll head out now." "Thanks for the tip, Sylvia. Stay inside." "Okay. I'll take care of it." As soon as the call ended, Sylvia felt a strange satisfaction. She had done her part. She had seen something that didn't look right and had acted quickly to alert the authorities. In her mind, Eastonville was now safer because of her vigilance. But what she didn't realize was that in her rush to act, she had set into motion a series of events that would unravel everything she thought she knew about the people around her and herself. Meanwhile, Morgan Walker was focused on her mission. She had parked her car behind an old oak tree just outside the abandoned farmhouse. The area was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the light breeze and the occasional bird call. The farmhouse had long been abandoned, its paint peeling and windows boarded up, making it an ideal location for secretive meetings or, as Morgan suspected, for the exchange of counterfeit bills. Morgan's instincts told her she wasn't far from uncovering something significant. The tire tracks she had seen earlier told her that someone had been there recently. Her training had prepared her for this exact moment, when all the pieces finally came together, when the investigation crossed over from suspicion to hard evidence. But there was something else Morgan knew for certain. Her cover had to remain intact. If local law enforcement got involved, especially someone with a more traditional approach, things could go sideways in an instant. As she stepped out of her car and walked toward the farmhouse, she couldn't help but feel a little on edge. She had handled much more dangerous situations in her career, but this felt different. It wasn't the usual criminal activity that she had dealt with. It wasn't the urgency of protecting national security or the high-stakes operations she was used to running. No, this was more personal. Sylvia had unknowingly made this mission her business, and now Morgan had to work in the shadows to avoid being discovered. The sound of tires crunching on gravel caught Morgan's attention. A police cruiser had pulled into the gravel driveway, its engine growling as it came to a stop. Morgan didn't recognize the officer behind the wheel. He was a tall, stocky man, his uniform a little too tight, his demeanor a little too eager. He looked like the type who wanted to make a name for himself, a rookie, or perhaps someone who'd been around long enough to know just how to wield his badge. Morgan's hand instinctively reached for her concealed weapon, but she quickly stopped herself. Her training was ingrained. There was no need to draw attention to herself just yet. She ducked behind the side of the farmhouse, watching from a crack in the boarded-up window. The officer got out of his car and started walking toward the house. Morgan had to think fast. She couldn't risk being caught in her position. Her mind raced through her options. She could confront him, bluff her way through the situation, or try to blend into the shadows. The problem was, the officer was already too close, too aware of the house's significance to not have been alerted by something. Maybe a call, maybe something he'd seen himself. Sylvia's involvement had thrown a wrench into everything. Suddenly, Morgan heard the sound of footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. Sylvia had been tailing her. The old woman's earlier suspicions had clearly gone further than just a casual glance. She was here now, just as Morgan had feared. Sylvia's voice, shrill and filled with confidence, cut through the silence. "There you are. I knew something was off with you," Sylvia yelled, her voice echoing in the stillness of the morning. "You're up to something, aren't you?" Morgan's heart sank. She could feel the danger approaching, and with it, the certainty that her mission had just gone from a quiet investigation to a full-blown confrontation. Sylvia, empowered by her assumptions and the complicity of Officer Reynolds, wasn't going to stop. She had made up her mind about who Morgan was, and it wasn't someone she could just walk away from. The officer's presence only added to the pressure mounting on Morgan. Her pulse quickened as she took a deep breath. There was no time for hesitation. She had to act. and act quickly. The revelation. The tension in the air was thick as Morgan stood frozen, crouching behind the dilapidated farmhouse. Sylvia's voice continued to pierce the air, filled with righteous certainty as she approached. "I knew it," Sylvia called out again, her words tinged with self-satisfaction. "You're hiding something, aren't you? Just what do you think you're doing in this town?" Morgan's pulse was racing, but her face remained calm. She had been in tight spots before, faced down situations much more dangerous than this one. But this wasn't just about getting out of a tricky situation. It was about protecting her cover and the mission that had brought her to Eastonville in the first place. Sylvia had already made her mind up about who Morgan was. A stranger, a threat, someone who didn't belong. Morgan knew she couldn't let the situation escalate further. She had no choice but to deal with Sylvia before her prejudices, and the complicity of Officer Reynolds turned what should have been a quiet operation into a full-blown disaster. As Sylvia closed in, Morgan slowly stood up, her movements calculated and deliberate. She could hear Officer Reynolds's boots crunching against the gravel behind her. He had arrived, ready to back up Sylvia's accusations with his badge. The worst-case scenario had arrived. A town filled with misunderstanding, where suspicion was all it took to paint someone as guilty. With quick, measured movements, Morgan turned to face the approaching Sylvia, her expression cool and unruffled. "Excuse me," Morgan said, her voice controlled but firm. "You've made some accusations, but I think you've got the wrong person. I'm not here to cause trouble, but if you don't let me explain, this is going to get a lot worse." Sylvia, standing just a few feet away now, snorted with disbelief. "A lot worse? You've been sneaking around here all morning, and now you expect me to believe you're some innocent tourist?" Her eyes were narrowed, full of contempt. "I know what you're up to, and I'm not letting someone like you cause trouble in my town." Morgan took a slow, steadying breath. Sylvia's words were steeped in years of deep-rooted bias. She wasn't just a stranger to Sylvia. She was everything Sylvia feared. The confident, self-assured black woman who wasn't supposed to be in Eastonville, the one who didn't fit into the small-town image Sylvia clung to so desperately. And in Sylvia's eyes, that made her a threat. But Sylvia didn't know who she was dealing with. She had no idea that Morgan Walker wasn't just any woman from out of town. She was a highly trained U.S. Secret Service agent, working undercover to prevent a major criminal operation from threatening the nation's economy. Before Sylvia could respond, Morgan took a decisive step forward, her badge now clearly visible in her hand. The glint of the golden seal caught Sylvia's eye, and her expression faltered for the first time. "I think you should take a moment to understand who I am before you continue accusing me of something," Morgan said calmly, the words punctuated by the flashing of her credentials. The badge shimmered in the sunlight, almost as if daring Sylvia to continue. Sylvia's face paled, the realization slowly sinking in. You're a government agent," she stammered, her voice suddenly lacking the bite it had just moments before. Morgan nodded slowly, her eyes locking with Sylvia's in a gaze that conveyed strength, authority, and a quiet threat. "That's right. I'm part of a task force investigating a large-scale operation that involves counterfeit money. I've been assigned to Eastonville because there's a drop-off location here. I'm not some outsider to be feared. I'm here to protect your town, not to hurt it." The words were heavy in the air, and for a moment, all was silent. Sylvia's face contorted in disbelief, the truth colliding with the prejudices she had long held. Her world, where everything fit neatly into categories of right and wrong, of people who belonged and people who didn't, was falling apart at the seams. Officer Reynolds, who had been standing silently behind Sylvia, looked at Morgan's badge in shock. He had been ready to jump into action, to act on Sylvia's tip, but now everything had changed. He had been ready to accuse an innocent woman based purely on his bias and Sylvia's call. His face reddened with the dawning realization that he might have been about to make a huge mistake. "Wait," Sylvia said, her voice now shaking. "This whole time, you were working for the government." Her voice wavered between awe and disbelief. Morgan nodded. "I'm here to stop a criminal operation. This isn't about me or you. It's about making sure that Eastonville doesn't become a part of something bigger. And if you get in my way, it'll make things harder for all of us." The words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. Sylvia, who had spent so long thinking she was the one who held power, was suddenly confronted with the reality that she had been wrong, not just about Morgan, but about how she saw people in general. She had painted this woman as a criminal when she was in fact a protector. The air was thick with tension as Morgan and Sylvia stared at one another. Officer Reynolds took a step back, processing the situation, trying to understand how quickly things had escalated from suspicion to revelation. He had thought this was just another routine call, but now the stakes were much higher. Morgan didn't wait for Sylvia to respond. "I suggest you get in touch with your local law enforcement, people who are actually trained for situations like this. This is far beyond small-town matters," she said firmly. Sylvia, her voice small now, was left without words. She had nothing left to say. Her assumptions had failed her, and she was left standing there, her world turned upside down. She had thought she was in control, but now she realized how little she truly understood. The town she had tried to protect, the traditions she had so fiercely held onto, were in no way immune to the complexities of the world beyond. Officer Reynolds, his pride wounded by the realization of his own misstep, turned to Morgan, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I should have." Morgan waved him off. "It's not about being sorry. It's about learning. We all have biases we need to face, myself included, but now's not the time for that." She gave them both one last look. "I have work to do." As Morgan turned and began walking back toward her car, her mind was already back in mission mode. The truth had come out, but the job wasn't over. The counterfeit ring was still active, and Eastonville had just become a key piece in an operation that reached far beyond its quiet borders. The unlikely hero. Morgan Walker's footsteps echoed softly against the gravel as she made her way back to her car. The weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air, but she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. The mission was still underway, and she had to remain focused. The town of Eastonville, for all its charm and quietude, was now directly connected to a much larger criminal enterprise. Her work was far from over. Behind her, Sylvia Henderson and Officer Reynolds stood in stunned silence. They had watched her walk away, but neither knew what to say next. For Sylvia, a woman who had spent most of her life in a bubble of assumptions and prejudices, the encounter had been a hard pill to swallow. The truth had shattered everything she believed about outsiders, about strangers, and about what it meant to be good or bad. Officer Reynolds stood, his eyes still on the spot where Morgan had disappeared behind the oak tree. He had been quick to judge, eager to please Sylvia and prove himself. But now, the weight of his actions, the possible consequences of his misplaced confidence, began to set in. His reputation, his role as a small-town cop trying to make a name for himself, suddenly seemed less important in the grand scheme of things. There was something bigger than petty authority, something more significant than the kind of control they thought they had over Eastonville. "You were wrong," Sylvia said, breaking the silence. Her voice, though softer now, still carried the edge of someone who hadn't fully accepted the shift in her reality. She glanced at Officer Reynolds, her face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. "I was wrong about her." Reynolds didn't answer at first, his gaze still lost in the distance. Then he turned to Sylvia and sighed deeply, the realization finally dawning on him. "We both were. We jumped to conclusions based on nothing." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking over at the farmhouse, then back to Sylvia. That woman wasn't the threat we thought she was. She was doing her job. A job that's a whole lot bigger than anything we're involved in. Sylvia's eyes fell to the ground, a deep, uncomfortable silence wrapping around her. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. She had been so certain that her assumptions were right, that she had acted out of pure concern for her town. But now, The reality of the situation made her question everything. I shouldn't have assumed she was a criminal," she admitted quietly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. "I should have minded my own business." The words hung in the air like a confession. Sylvia, for the first time, allowed herself to confront her biases. For so many years, she had felt justified in her judgments, believing she was the one who had a right to defend Eastonville, to protect its way of life. But the truth, the real truth, was far more complicated than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, Morgan was back in her car, driving away from the farmhouse with a clear head, but her thoughts still wandered. The revelation that Sylvia and Officer Reynolds had made their own mistakes didn't fill her with satisfaction. It didn't bring her joy or a sense of triumph. What she had just witnessed was a reminder of how deeply prejudice could cloud judgment. It was a reminder of how easily assumptions could turn into accusations, and how the truth could often be buried under layers of fear and ignorance. But what made Morgan proud wasn't that she had shown Sylvia and Reynolds their error. It was that she had stayed true to her mission. She had acted with professionalism, with dignity, and with the calm under pressure that her training had instilled in her. She hadn't let her cover be blown. She hadn't let herself be taken off course by an unwarranted confrontation. She had kept her focus, knowing that the greater good was what mattered, not petty squabbles or personal bias. As Morgan drove down the winding roads, a sense of clarity washed over her. This town, Eastonville, would never be the same. And neither would Sylvia or Officer Reynolds. They would both walk away from this encounter with a deeper understanding, not just of who Morgan was, but of themselves. The biases they held had been exposed, and while it might have been uncomfortable, it was a necessary step. There was a possibility, however slim, that they might change. But more importantly, the people around them, the town, the community, would now be on alert. They would have to start questioning the assumptions they had held for years. They would have to start thinking beyond the confines of their small town. Morgan's mind shifted back to her work, to the investigation that was still unfolding. Sylvia and Reynolds might have been shaken by this encounter, but they weren't the ones who mattered in the long run. What mattered was that Morgan's mission was still active, that she was still on the trail of the counterfeit ring. It wasn't just about righting the wrongs in Eastonville, but about keeping the country safe. The truth was, she had a much bigger role to play, one that reached far beyond the streets of this small town. But as she passed through the outskirts of Eastonville, Morgan allowed herself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope that one day Sylvia and Reynolds, like so many others, could learn from their mistakes. And that, in itself, was a victory. In a world where assumptions often shape reality, the power of truth, integrity, and the willingness to change was something that would leave a lasting impact. For Eastonville, for Morgan, and even for Sylvia and Officer Reynolds, this day would never be forgotten. They would remember the lesson learned, the confrontation, and how one woman, an ordinary stranger, had exposed the hidden prejudices lurking just beneath the surface. As Morgan continued on her mission, she couldn't help but think that sometimes the smallest of encounters could spark the greatest of changes. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.